Ibiza. August 15, 2023. 2:47 a.m. Eddie Burton is dancing in the VIP section of Pacha nightclub, completely unaware that in exactly 23 minutes, his £20 million drug empire will come crashing down. But here's what'll blow your mind. This 23-year-old baby-faced mastermind made one microscopic mistake. A mistake so simple, so incredibly careless, that it unraveled an international operation spanning 3 countries and destroyed the lives of everyone he touched. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a single fingerprint became the most expensive mistake in British drug trafficking history. This is Crime Scene Chronicles, and tonight, Paradise Burns. Liverpool. A city that breeds legends and monsters. The same streets that gave us the Beatles also gave us Curtis "Cocky" Warren, once so wealthy from drug trafficking that he appeared on the Sunday Times rich list. This is a city where crime isn't just business, it's heritage. But in the early 2010s, as teenage Eddie Burton walked these very streets, nobody could have predicted that this ordinary kid would surpass them all. Eddie Burton wasn't born into crime royalty. No family connections to established gangs. No inherited territory or protection. He was just another teenager in a city full of teenagers with big dreams and limited options. What made Eddie different wasn't his background, it was his ambition. And his complete lack of fear. By his late teens, while his friends were worried about GCSE results and weekend jobs, Eddie was already studying a different curriculum entirely. He was learning the economics of international drug trafficking. The logistics of moving product across borders. The art of staying invisible while building an empire. And he was learning fast. But here's what makes Eddie Burton's story truly chilling. He didn't start small like every other criminal. No street corner dealing, no working his way up through established hierarchies. This teenager looked at the entire European drug trade and thought, I can do this better. The question wasn't whether Eddie had the intelligence to pull it off. The question was whether he had the discipline to keep his mouth shut and his fingerprints clean. Spoiler alert, he didn't. Early 2021. Age 19. While most teenagers are deciding which university to attend, Eddie Burton made a decision that would change everything. He left Liverpool behind. Not as a fugitive running from rival gangs. Not escaping debt or danger. Eddie Burton left England as an entrepreneur seeking opportunity. He saw Europe not as foreign territory, but as an untapped market. His first stop? Amsterdam. The drug capital of Europe. From an unremarkable flat in the Netherlands, Eddie began building something that would later be described by investigators as sophisticated beyond his years. But he wasn't working alone. Enter Sian Banks. 25 years old. Liverpool native. Beautiful, intelligent, and completely devoted to her younger boyfriend's vision of the good life. To anyone watching Sian's social media, she was living the dream. Monthly trips to Amsterdam and Spain. Designer clothes. Expensive restaurants. The kind of lifestyle that makes people hit follow and wonder how she affords it all. The answer was simple, Eddie Burton was paying for everything. And Sian was earning every penny. Between June 2022 and October 2023, Sian made monthly pilgrimages to visit Eddie across Europe. But these weren't romantic getaways. These were business trips. Phone evidence would later reveal that on at least 2 occasions in August 2022, Sian smuggled cocaine and ketamine into the UK in her luggage after visiting Eddie in Amsterdam. Picture this. A young woman walking through Liverpool John Lennon Airport, smiling at customs officers, looking like any other tourist returning home. In her suitcase? Thousands of pounds worth of Class A drugs. The audacity is breathtaking. But it gets worse. Because the personal luggage runs? They were just Eddie testing the waters. What he was really planning would make those airport runs look like pocket change. He was about to attempt something so ambitious, so ridiculously large-scale, that even seasoned investigators would struggle to believe it. But first, Eddie needed to solve a problem that has destroyed every drug empire in history. How do you move industrial quantities of narcotics across international borders without getting caught? His solution was elegant. His execution was flawless. His downfall was inevitable. Dover, the gateway to Britain. Every single day, thousands of lorries pass through this port carrying legitimate cargo, food, clothing, electronics, everything that keeps modern Britain functioning. But on July 3, 2022, one lorry carried something very different. Border Force officers conducting a routine stop opened the back of a seemingly normal truck and discovered something that would haunt their dreams: 90 kilos of ketamine and 50 kilos of cocaine. Let me put that in perspective for you. 90 kilos of ketamine alone has a street value of approximately £900,000. The cocaine? Another £2 million. Nearly £3 million worth of drugs in a single shipment. And here's the detail that shows you exactly who you're dealing with. The drugs were packed into boxes and stuffed into a little shopping bag. A little bag. This teenager was moving millions of pounds worth of narcotics in a supermarket carrier bag like he was bringing home the weekly shopping. But Eddie Burton wasn't satisfied with nearly bankrupting one shipment. He was just getting started. 6 weeks later, he tried again. And this time, he thought he'd been cleverer. August 12, 2022. Dover Port. Another lorry, another routine stop. But this time, Border Force officers couldn't immediately see any drugs. That's because Eddie had learned from his previous mistake. This time, the drugs weren't just packed in boxes. They were hidden in a fuel tank that had been specially modified to conceal the cargo. Inside that tank, 142 kilos of cocaine and 25 kilos of heroin. 142 kilos of cocaine. That's enough to supply entire cities for months. The street value? Over £15 million. Combined with the heroin, this single shipment was worth approximately £17 million. The courier was 64-year-old Latvian national Maris Fridvalds, who would later claim he had no idea what he was carrying. Whether you believe that or not, he's currently serving 14 years in a British prison. Let's add this up. 2 shipments. 6 weeks apart. Combined weight, 307 kilos. Combined street value, £20 million. £20 million. That's more money than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. And it was being orchestrated by a 21-year-old from Liverpool who thought he was smarter than every law enforcement agency in Europe. He was about to learn otherwise. But here's where this story takes a turn that's so satisfying, so perfectly ironic, that if you put it in a movie, people would say it was unrealistic. Before I reveal the mistake that brought down Eddie's empire, I need to ask you something. If you're as obsessed with these real-life crime stories as I am, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next in Eddie's story is exactly why Crime Scene Chronicles exists, to show you how the most careful criminals make the most careless mistakes. Trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. You see, Eddie Burton believed he was untouchable. Living the high life in Europe, girlfriend making regular courier runs, millions of pounds flowing through his operation. He had aliases, safe houses, encrypted communications. He thought he'd covered every angle. But there's one thing about crime that every criminal learns eventually. It's not the big, dramatic mistakes that destroy you. It's the tiny, everyday oversights that you never see coming. And Eddie's oversight was about to become legendary. Back at Dover, forensic investigators were meticulously examining both drug seizures. They dusted for fingerprints on every surface, the packaging, the containers, the modified fuel tank, everything. What they found changed everything. Eddie Burton's fingerprints and DNA were all over both consignments. Not just traces. Not just partial prints. Full, clear, identifiable fingerprints on multiple surfaces. This 21-year-old criminal mastermind had personally handled millions of pounds worth of drugs and left his calling card on everything he touched. But the evidence gets even more damning. Remember that modified fuel tank from the second shipment? The one that was specially designed to fool customs officers? Eddie's fingerprints were inside that tank. He'd literally crawled inside a fuel compartment to arrange the drugs, leaving perfect prints on the metal surface. It's like he wanted to get caught. But wait, it gets worse. While forensic investigators were building their case, Eddie and Sean were still communicating, completely unaware that their entire operation had been compromised. July 5, 2022. Just 2 days after the first massive seizure at Dover. Eddie and Sean are messaging each other on what they thought were secure phones. Sean tells Eddie that her fingerprints are on the bags of ketamine from the shipment. Any normal criminal would panic at this point. Any normal criminal would realize the operation was blown and run for the hills. Eddie's response? You've never been nicked or had your prints took anyway, so doesn't matter. Those were his famous last words. What Eddie didn't realize is that it didn't matter whether Sean had been arrested before. What mattered was that investigators now had both their fingerprints on £20 million worth of drugs, and they were about to connect the baby-faced mastermind who thought he was too smart to get caught had just handed law enforcement everything they needed to destroy him. But he still didn't know it. And for over a year, Eddie continued living in paradise, completely oblivious to the net closing around him. With forensic evidence tying Eddie to both massive seizures, the National Crime Agency launched Operation Venetic, an international manhunt for Britain's most wanted young drug lord. But Eddie Burton had vanished into the European underworld like a ghost. Intelligence suggested he was moving between the Netherlands and Spain, using multiple aliases, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. He'd become a phantom, existing in the spaces between official records and surveillance networks. Meanwhile, back in Liverpool, Sian Banks continued her monthly pilgrimages to Europe, playing the role of devoted girlfriend while the net tightened around both of them. But Sian wasn't just making social visits. Phone evidence would later reveal she was running her own criminal enterprises. During the height of the COVID pandemic, while people were dying and borders were closed, Sian was operating a scam selling fake COVID travel documents. She was profiting from people's desperation to see dying relatives or escape lockdowns. The moral bankruptcy is staggering. And through it all, Eddie remained untouchable in his European paradise, believing his careful planning and multiple identities would protect him forever. For 13 months, Eddie Burton lived like a king. Spanish beaches, Amsterdam nightlife, endless money, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd outsmarted every law enforcement agency in Britain. But here's what Eddie didn't understand about international investigations: they take time. Lots of time. Investigators weren't just building a case, they were building an unbreakable case. Phone records, financial transactions, travel patterns, forensic evidence, digital footprints, witness statements. Every piece of evidence was being carefully catalogued and cross-referenced. The National Crime Agency wasn't just hunting Eddie Burton. They were preparing to obliterate any possible defense he might mount. And while Eddie partied in the sun, convinced he'd achieved the impossible, investigators were closing in on the one thing every fugitive fears most: a routine police encounter. Because no matter how careful you are, no matter how many aliases you use, no matter how paranoid you become, sometimes you just get unlucky. And Eddie Burton's luck was about to run out in the most spectacular, publicly humiliating way imaginable. August 2023. Ibiza. The party capital of the world, where the music never stops and the drinks never run dry. For wealthy young Europeans, Ibiza represents the ultimate escape from reality. And nobody was escaping reality quite like Eddie Burton. Designer clothes, VIP sections, endless champagne. At 23 years old with millions in drug money burning holes in his pockets, Eddie was living every young person's fantasy. But fantasy has a way of colliding with reality when you least expect it. On this particular night, Eddie chose to party at Pacha, one of Ibiza's most legendary superclubs. The kind of place where celebrities rub shoulders with millionaires and nobody asks too many questions about where the money comes from. The bass is pounding, the lights are strobing, and Eddie is on top of the world. In his mind, he's untouchable. He's the teenager who beat the system, who built an empire and vanished into paradise. What he doesn't know is that Spanish police have been watching him. 2:47 a.m. Spanish police enter Pacha nightclub. Eddie Burton, using an alias to evade detection, is arrested on the dance floor for unrelated local drug dealing offenses. The baby-faced kingpin who thought he could party his way to freedom is dragged out of paradise in handcuffs, past hundreds of clubbers who have no idea they're witnessing the end of a £20 million criminal empire. But here's the beautiful irony. Eddie's arrest in Ibiza had nothing to do with the massive drug operation that had consumed years of international investigation. Spanish police grabbed him for small-time local dealing, the kind of petty crime that every investigation manual warns you to avoid when you're already wanted for major felonies. Eddie Burton, who had successfully evaded an international manhunt for over a year, was brought down by the criminal equivalent of getting a parking ticket. And the best part? He had no idea that back in the UK, investigators had been building an ironclad case against him for months. If you're sitting there thinking, how could he be so stupid, then you understand exactly why I started Crime Scene Chronicles. The gap between criminal ambition and criminal intelligence is where the most fascinating stories live. And Eddie's story is just getting started, so make sure you're subscribed because the final act of this saga will leave you speechless. Eddie's arrest in Ibiza triggered a carefully orchestrated international legal dance that would take months to complete. First, he was extradited to Germany to face drug charges there. Then, in March 2024, specialist National Extradition Unit officers from the NCA's Joint International Crime Centre finally brought him back to the UK. After over 2 years of investigation, Eddie Burton was finally going to face British justice. Meanwhile, Sean's world was collapsing in spectacular fashion. December 2023. Sean Banks was arrested at her Liverpool home. The monthly trips to Amsterdam, the drugs smuggled in her luggage, the money laundering, the fake COVID documents, investigators had evidence of everything. But Sean had one advantage Eddie didn't: she understood when the game was over. February 3, 2025. Canterbury Crown Court. The first day of Sean Banks' trial. She walked into that courtroom knowing that investigators had phone records, travel patterns, forensic evidence, and witness testimony that would destroy any defense she might attempt. So she didn't attempt one. Sean Banks pleaded guilty to 7 charges, including importing Class A drugs and money laundering. Eddie Burton, faced with the same overwhelming evidence, had already pleaded guilty to 4 counts of importing Class A and B drugs. The baby-faced mastermind and his glamorous accomplice were finally facing the consequences of their choices. As I finish telling you this story, Eddie Burton and Sean Banks are sitting in prison cells, awaiting sentencing. The drugs they tried to flood British streets with have been destroyed. The 64-year-old courier is serving 14 years. The money has been seized. And somewhere in that cell, Eddie is probably replaying every decision that led him here. The decision to leave Liverpool for Amsterdam. The decision to handle drugs personally instead of using intermediaries. The decision to use his girlfriend as a courier. The decision to party in Ibiza instead of staying hidden. But most of all, the decision to touch those drugs with his bare hands. One fingerprint. That's all it took to unravel a £20 million operation. Eddie Burton's story isn't just about crime and punishment. It's about hubris. It's about the intoxicating belief that youth and intelligence can overcome experience and caution. This wasn't a career criminal who got unlucky. This was a teenager who looked at the entire international drug trade and thought, I can do this better than everyone who came before me. And for a brief, shining moment, he almost did. But almost doesn't count in the criminal justice system. Almost doesn't protect you when forensic investigators find your fingerprints on £20 million worth of drugs. Almost is just another word for failure. Eddie Burton went from ordinary Liverpool teenager to international drug kingpin to convicted criminal in just 4 years. His empire stretched across 3 countries, employed dozens of people, and generated millions in revenue. All of it destroyed by something every first-time shoplifter knows: don't leave fingerprints. The party's over, Eddie. Paradise is closed. That's another case closed here at Crime Scene Chronicles, where we dive deep into the criminal minds that thought they could beat the system. Eddie Burton's story proves that intelligence without wisdom is just elaborate stupidity. And sometimes, the most sophisticated criminal operations are brought down by the most basic mistakes. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand how criminal empires rise and fall, how investigators build unbreakable cases, and how one small mistake can destroy everything, then Crime Scene Chronicles is exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now, because trust me, the criminal underworld has plenty more stories like Eddie's. Stories of ambition and arrogance, of paradise and prison, of the fine line between criminal genius and criminal stupidity. And remember, in the game of crime, the house always wins in the end. Until next time, this is Crime Scene Chronicles, signing off.